My mother taught me to count before she taught me to read. Not because she thought numbers were more important than words, but because in the years after Bombardment 11, counting was how you held yourself together. You counted the people in the shelter with you. You counted the water rations and the food packages and the hours remaining on the air recyclers. You counted the rumbles from the rock above, 1 through 6, because Bombardment 11 came in 2 waves of 3 impacts each, and you held the pattern of it in your mind, because patterns meant there was still an order to things, even when the sky above you was doing its best to prove otherwise. I was 7 years old in Shelter 2 on Heron's Reach when the second wave started. The shelter had been cut into bedrock 200 meters below the coastal shelf, and it was full of farming families, 114 people the first night, 11 more who had come in through the eastern access tunnel on the 3rd morning after Bombardment 10, the kind of careful late arrivals who had waited to make sure the all clear wasn't a false signal before they moved. 125 people, total, when the 6th impact of Bombardment 11's second wave hit. The eastern access tunnel collapsed at the 3rd junction. Nobody in the tunnel at the time. The 11 people who had walked through it 3 mornings earlier were already in the main chamber, sitting against the south wall with their packs on their laps, not talking. The collapse sealed us in, is what it did. We had enough air and water for 40 days. The rescue bore reached us on day 19. The 11 people who died in Shelter 2 during Bombardment 11 were not the ones in the tunnel. They were the 11 who died in the sealed shelter over 19 days. From a combination of things that the after-action medical report categorized as shelter incident mortality, 2 cardiac events, 1 infection from an untreated wound received in the run to the shelter, 1 death in childbirth with complications that a surface hospital would have managed, 4 deaths from pre-existing conditions that deteriorated without access to treatment, and 3 others that the report listed under the catch-all of environmental exposure, which was the medical examiner's way of saying that the conditions in the shelter over 19 days were not compatible with life for people who were already fragile when they came in. 125 people entered Shelter 2. 114 came out. I was one of the 114. I have been one of the ones who came out for 31 years. I have counted a great many things in that time. The Calveth Compact was not a raider faction. That is important to understand before anything else about this account makes sense. They were not pirates, not zealots running on religious logic, not a machine intelligence optimizing against biology. They were, by every available measure, including their own extensive and very carefully maintained records, a pure civilization, a multi-world compact of 31 member states, an interstellar administrative infrastructure that had been functioning continuously for 417 years, a legal tradition they were genuinely proud of, a diplomatic corps with decades of treaty experience, and a foreign policy apparatus staffed entirely by people with advanced degrees who wrote memos in precise, measured language about proportionate response and escalation thresholds and the deeply regrettable but operationally necessary requirements of firm action in defense of compact sovereign interests. Deeply regrettable. That phrase appears 43 times in the Foreign Policy Directorate's Internal Documentation on Pacification Decree 4. I counted. You count the things that need counting. The deeply regrettable necessity, in the case of the Outer Ring human settlements, was a document their Foreign Policy Directorate had spent 14 months producing, a 312-page legal finding with 7 appendices that concluded that human expansion into the Outer Ring constituted an ongoing act of hostile encroachment under Compact Security Protocol 7, subsection 19C, which authorized member states to take defensive action against persistent incursions into designated Compact strategic territory. The designation, the Calveth exclusion belt, which is what their internal documents called the region we had been settling for 60 years, appeared in a single compact administrative document from 61 years before Pacification Decree 4. That document was internal. It had never been communicated to the Interstellar Settlement Commission, never shared with any human government, never registered with any interstellar body that maintained records of territorial claims. The human settlement program in the Outer Ring had been established under the Heron's Accord, a framework the Compact had helped write and had formally endorsed. The Compact's Foreign Policy Directorate had spent 14 months arguing, in 312 pages and 7 appendices, that the internal designation superseded the public accord. Appendix C, pages 247 through 261, is the proportionality analysis. It runs 14 pages. It calculates, in careful bureaucratic language, the threshold of civilian casualties that constitutes a legally defensible level of collateral damage under compact security law. It arrives at a figure. The figure is not 11,204,917. The figure they calculated was substantially lower, and the analysis notes, in its concluding paragraph, that the Directorate expects calibrated operational pressure across a multi-year timeline to remain within the defensible threshold by virtue of the distributed nature of the campaign and its focus on surface infrastructure rather than shelter systems. Distributed, calibrated, across a multi-year timeline. I have read that document 4 times in my life. First at 18, in the Signals Intelligence track at the Fleet Academy, when the senior analyst who assigned it to me said, "Read every word and don't skip the footnotes, because the footnotes are where they buried the things they knew were indefensible." Second time, at 26, when I was assigned to the Documentation Commission and needed to understand the operational logic behind the bombardment sequencing. Third time at 31, in the week before deployment, when I wanted to remember precisely what I was carrying aboard the weight of ruins. Fourth time in the transit period on the way to the Calveth primary system, 3 days before day 1, sitting in my bunk with the document on my reader at 0300 when I couldn't sleep. The fourth time I reached Appendix C and read the proportionality threshold paragraph. I closed the document and sat in the dark for a while. Not because it was new information, because precision matters, even when the thing you're being precise about is the shape of the justification that killed 11 million people, 47 bombardments, 6 worlds, 11 years. The casualty figures were assembled by the Recovered Worlds Documentation Commission, which was established 2 months after the Compact's final bombardment, Bombardment 47, by the Interstellar Policy Council. The Commission's mandate was to produce an accurate and complete accounting of the dead, the displaced, the surviving population, and the physical condition of each of the 6 worlds affected. It ran for 2 years and produced 17 volumes of documentation. The final casualty figure, arrived at through cross-referencing of deep-bore shelter records, colony death registries, satellite imagery from before each bombardment, survivor testimony, the partial infrastructure data that could be recovered from the destroyed, settlement networks, and eventually the Compact's own internal damage assessment files, which were meticulous, precise, and written in the flat institutional language of people who understood that what they were recording was not the cost to them, but the cost they were inflicting, was 11,204,915 confirmed dead, with an uncertainty band of plus or minus 60,000 for records destroyed in the administrative archive collapse during Bombardment 31. I was assigned to the commission as a liaison officer in my 2nd year after the academy. Signals intelligence background, Calveth language certifications, clearance to handle the captured administrative files that had been obtained through the intelligence operations running in parallel with the Commission's documentation work. My posting was to a converted transport bay in a shared facility on Heron's Reach, which had been partially resettled by then, the coastal shelf still torn up from multiple bombardment series, the flats in better shape. The deep-bore shelters opened up and converted to storage, where a team of 12 analysts worked 8-hour shifts in a room that smelled of recycled air and the particular cold coffee staleness of long documentation projects. The commission director was Kathy Solon. She was 62 when I worked for her, a small, precise woman who had been an administrative judge in the Outer Ring settlement court system before. Bombardment 22 had killed everyone she was related to on Morale's outer shelf. She ran the commission with the quietest discipline I have encountered in 20 years of professional work. No speeches about what we were doing or why it mattered. No visible grief in the workspace. Not because it wasn't there, but because she had decided, in whatever way she made decisions, that keeping it out of the workspace was a form of respect for the work itself. Every morning she came in, sat down, opened her files and worked. Every evening she logged the day's count and went home. She told me once, when I asked her how she approached it, that the figures we were building deserved precision above everything else. The people we're counting are already dead, she said. We can't do anything about that. What we can do is make the count right. That's what we owe them. I have carried that framing for 11 years. It is the cleanest thing I have ever been told about what accurate work means, when the subject is people who are no longer able to speak for themselves. The figure 11,200,917 is accurate. I helped build it. I know exactly where it comes from and how it was verified. I know the uncertainty band, and I know why 60,000 records could not be fully confirmed, and I know the specific bombardment, number 31, that destroyed the Pelun's Rest archive and created that gap. The figure is as precise as the available evidence allows, and the available evidence was searched with complete thoroughness. It is accurate. When the Documentation Commission published its final report, it triggered a political process that was, by any measure, the shortest serious deliberation in human foreign policy history. The question was what to do about it. The answer that some members of the Interstellar Policy Council favored was a targeted response. A fleet deployment sufficient to destroy the compact's military orbital infrastructure, a formal demand for reparations, a negotiated accountability framework that would include international oversight, and a formal memorial to the dead. Proportionate, measured, calibrated. That last word chosen by the targeted response block without apparent awareness of how precisely it echoed the Foreign Policy Directorate's language in Appendix C. The discussion ran 6 days. I watched some of it from the Commission's liaison office in the Council Chamber complex, when my work schedule permitted. The members of the targeted response block made careful arguments. They were listened to with respect and in full. There was a vote. The margin was not close. The Recovered Worlds Fleet Authorization Act passed on a Thursday afternoon. It authorized the deployment of the full Outer Ring Fleet Reserve, supplemented by inter-system fleet elements, in sufficient force to conduct comprehensive operations against all Calveth compact military, governmental, and industrial infrastructure. It specified that the objective was the permanent elimination of the compact's capacity to conduct offensive operations against any external settlement or population. It specified that the operational timeline should be determined by Fleet Command, in accordance with the target annex appended to the Authorization Act, and that Fleet Command had full operational discretion within the terms of the Act. I was in the Commission's liaison office when the vote was announced. I was sitting next to Catha Solon, who had attended because the Commission had submitted a formal brief to the Council in support of comprehensive action. She watched the tally board go to final result, and she picked up her notebook and she wrote something, and she closed the notebook without saying anything. She showed me what she had written later when we were walking back to the document bay. She had written the number 11,204,917 in her careful, even hand, and next to it in smaller script 2 words, everyone. That is the framing I carried aboard the weight of ruins. The Armada assembly took 14 months. I spent 12 of those months in a signals intelligence posting on the planning staff, working the signals intelligence component of the targeting annex, the compact's communications architecture, their relay network topology, the cipher systems we had been working against. For 2 years, the broadcast protocols their command network used for operational coordination. It is detailed, exact work, and I was good at it. and I found it clarifying in a way I had not found the documentation work clarifying. Because the documentation work was about what had already happened, and the signals work was about what was going to happen. And there is a different quality of attention required when you are building towards something, rather than accounting for something that is already done. 941 warships, 14 carrier battle groups. The Calder lines as lead formation. They had been running convoy escort in the outer ring for 11 years, through all 47 bombardments, doing what they could with standing orders that prohibited offensive engagement. They had watched the bombardments from convoy range. Their crews knew what the weight of ruins was going to do, and they had earned the front column designation in a way that required no further argument. Fleet Admiral Devith Oren in command. He had run the outer ring escort operations for the last 4 years of the campaign, and he had been on the bridge of the escort carrier Heron's Det when Bombardment 43 hit Peleth's crossing, and he had logged a formal protest with Fleet Command that day, under standing orders, noting that his forces were in position to intercept and had been denied authorization, and that the denial of authorization had been logged and would stand in the record. It was in the record. Everything was in the record. My assignment to the weight of ruins came through 6 weeks before departure. 2nd Signals Lieutenant, Signals Intercept and Analysis Division. I read the orders twice, and then a third time, which is the counting habit. Once for comprehension, once for confirmation, once for the particular quality of attention that I have given to important documents since Shelter 2. 8 Calveth member worlds, 3 relay stations, 2 administrative platforms, 47 days of planned operations, the same number as the bombardments. I noted that in my personal log the day I read the operational briefing packet, and I noted it again in the margin of my copy of the briefing, and I thought about it for a long time. Coincidence is a possible explanation. The distance and force math and target set logistics producing a natural 47-day operational arc that happened to match the bombardment count. I have never been able to verify whether it was deliberate. The operational planning documents I have been cleared to see don't address it. What I can say is that when I saw the number, it settled something for me. The way the right count settles something. The way you reach the end of a tally, and the number is what it should be, and you close the ledger because the ledger is right. Day 1. The weight of ruins came out of transit into the Calveth primary system at 6:14 standard time. My watch had started at 600. I was at my signal station, headset on, intercept board active, watching the frequency assignments populate as our systems came up to full operational sensitivity in the new environment. The first signals traffic I captured from compact networks was routine administrative chatter on their commercial frequencies. The background noise of a functioning civilization going about its morning, supply routing confirmations, personnel schedule updates, a maintenance request from a civilian communications hub on Calveth Primary's Eastern Continental Network, the sounds of a place that didn't know yet. Then their long-range arrays finished processing the transit signatures, and the tone of the traffic changed. Signals intelligence work involves learning to read the texture of traffic before you read the content. Volume, frequency, cipher complexity, routing patterns. These tell you what the network is doing before decryption tells you what it's saying. What the compact's military traffic told me, in the 30 minutes after their arrays processed our arrival, was a network going to high alert status across all major nodes simultaneously. The cipher complexity jumped in the first 6 minutes, longer key cycles, rapid rotation, the signature of a network that had been planning for this and was executing its preparation protocol. The volume spiked. The routing patterns showed traffic flooding from the outer system monitoring stations inward toward primary command nodes. Their analysts had told their command structure to expect a proportionate response. 60 to 80 warships, sufficient to destroy Calveth Primary's military orbital infrastructure and make a credible threat to their governmental centers. the kind of deployment that ends with a negotiated settlement. Their defensive posture had been built against that estimate. 941 warships does not end in a negotiated settlement. 941 warships is a statement that doesn't require interpretation. I watched their traffic process the discrepancy between their estimate and the transit signature data, and I logged everything as it came in. And at 0711, I flagged a high-priority command burst to Fleet Admiral Oren's operations officer. Compact Primary Military Command has requested emergency governmental authorization for full defensive mobilization under their contingency protocol. 11. Routing the decoded text now. The Admiral had already begun Day 1 operations. He did not wait for the Compact's internal authorization process to complete before his formation began moving. I want to be careful here, because there is a version of what happened over the 47 days that people tell and retell that softens it in a way I find imprecise. The softened version says the Compact didn't have time to respond, that the operations moved faster than their coordination could manage, that the asymmetry was purely logistical. That is not accurate. They had time. They had 17 formal ceasefire requests filed through the Interstellar Settlement Commission's emergency protocols. They had 9 offers of negotiation communicated through the Commission's diplomatic channel, which we had agreed to keep open before departure specifically so they would have the channel. They had 4 reparations framework proposals, 2 offers of binding arbitration, and on day 29, they had Fleet Admiral Oren receiving a direct broadcast address from High Administrator Verleth Khan on every available frequency, in which the High Administrator expressed what he called full and unreserved remorse for the losses suffered by human outer ring communities under Pacification Decree 4, acknowledged that the Compact's operations had produced casualties that no proportionality analysis, however carefully constructed, could defend as within acceptable limits, and offered to accept whatever accountability framework the Human Fleet Command specified. The High Administrator had a careful voice. 40 years in administrative leadership gives a person command of their tone in ways that are professionally useful, and Verleth Khan was not performing when he broadcast on day 29. He was trying, in the only way still available to him, to stop what was happening. He named the bombardments. He named the Documentation Commission's figure, 11,200,917, which he used without qualification, which told me his people had read the Commission's report and found it more credible than their own internal damage assessments, he said, in the formal accountability construction that the Compact's administrative language uses for institutional confession, that the decision to implement Pacification Decree 4 had been wrong, that the legal framework constructed to justify it had failed to account for the moral reality of what it was doing, and that the Compact accepted responsibility for every death the Commission's final count. He was 11 years too late. He was 43 bombardments too late. He was 14 months of Armada assembly too late. He was 9 months of Documentation Commission work too late. He was 11,204,917 people too late. Fleet Admiral Oren received the broadcast. I logged it and filed a record of receipt with the operations log. The Admiral did not respond. Operations continued. I tracked the signals through all 47 days. In the first week, the Compact's military traffic was high volume and operationally dense. The kind of traffic that tells you a command network is actively coordinating defense across multiple theaters, routing resources, managing communication between dispersed command nodes under pressure. The cipher quality held through day 4. On day 5, the first major relay node in their outer system came down, and the routing patterns shifted to compensate, and the shift introduced inefficiencies that their cipher management couldn't fully absorb. By the end of the first week, the cipher quality had degraded measurably: shorter key cycles, slower rotation, simpler structure. Organizations under severe operational pressure make shortcuts. The shortcuts accumulate, the cipher degrades. The traffic tells you things the senders didn't intend to transmit. What it told me in the second week was that their primary outer system command network had lost coherence, not destroyed, fragmented. Too many nodes down, too many rerouted connections introducing latency, too many command decisions being made without full network awareness because the awareness nodes were gone. The traffic was doing what disrupted command traffic always does, which is trying to be the same network it was before, on a fraction of the infrastructure, and failing in ways that are legible to anyone paying careful enough attention. I paid careful attention. That is the work. On day 12, their secondary relay station, the one covering the approaches to Calveth Tertiary, went off the air, not destroyed. We hadn't reached it yet. It had been taken offline by its own operators, which I inferred from the shutdown sequence in the traffic, a controlled power down rather than the abrupt signal cut that indicates destruction. Someone had decided to take it offline preemptively, probably because they judged it was about to become a target and wanted to prevent whatever they were running through it from being captured. Sound operational thinking. 11 days too late to matter for the broader question, but sound in itself. I logged the shutdown and noted the inference and moved to the next intercept. In the third week, the character of the traffic changed in a way I want to describe slightly, because it is not something I have seen discussed accurately in the retrospective accounts. The traffic was no longer primarily operational. There were still operational elements, coordination of the remaining defensive assets, communication between command nodes that were still functioning, but the dominant register had shifted to something I can only describe as institutional accounting. Inventory messages, personnel disposition records, asset status reports, the flat, thorough language of an administration that is documenting its own condition. I recognized the register because I had spent 9 months doing exactly that kind of work for the Documentation Commission, and what I was reading was its mirror image. We had documented what they had done. They were documenting what we were doing to them. The quality of attention in both projects is the same. Every line item, every status, every figure that can be verified, recorded with the completeness that the subject deserves. There is something I thought about in the third and fourth weeks that I have not found a way to express cleanly in any of the accounts I have given since. I will try here, because this is my account, and I am entitled to put the full thing in it. The Calveth Compact, at some level that I believe was real, understood what they had done. Not the population of 800 million people distributed across 8 worlds, who in the main were going about their lives with whatever access to information their administrative state provided. But the people who wrote the documentation, the damned assessors whose files I had spent months reading, the analysts whose threat assessments filled the captured intelligence archives, the Foreign Policy Directorate staff who had written 312 pages and 7 appendices, those people knew. The flat institutional tone of their documentation is not the tone of people who have successfully convinced themselves that what they are recording is acceptable. It is the tone of people who have made a decision and are now recording it with the thoroughness that professionals bring to their work, regardless of what they think about the decision. I know that tone because it is the same tone I have used in my own documentation work when I was recording things I found difficult. Precision as a form of discipline. Accuracies as the only integrity available when the integrity of the decision itself is not something you control. They knew. The High Administrator knew when he broadcast on day 29. The precise, careful language of his broadcast, the way he used our casualty figure, the way he used the word wrong without qualification, the way he didn't attempt to relitigate the legal justifications he had spent years building. That was the language of someone who had worked through to the other side of it and was looking at the full scope of what the 312 pages had produced. I don't know if it was easier or harder to be on the receiving end of 47 days from someone who knew exactly what they had done. I know what it felt like from where I was sitting. It felt complete in a way that violence against ignorance doesn't feel complete. The account was being settled with full knowledge of what it was settling on both sides. The High Administrator's broadcast on day 29 was not an attempt to reframe what had happened. It was an acknowledgement that there was no reframing available. And Fleet Admiral Oran's non-response was not cruelty. It was the same acknowledgement expressed differently. The account was already specified. The 47 days were the specification. Words on top of that would have been imprecision. On day 19, I intercepted a communication on a civilian frequency, an administrative officer on Calveth Secondary writing to a colleague on Calveth Tertiary, asking whether the colleague's family had reached the deep bore shelters and whether there was reliable information about the resupply convoys to the Tertiary system's southern settlements. It had been routed through a civilian relay node that the military had commandeered when their own network degraded. The message was not encrypted at all. It was written in the flat, practical language of someone managing their fear by asking concrete questions. I logged it. I did not flag it to the operations element. It was not operationally significant. I kept a copy in my personal files. I kept it because that kind of precision matters too. Not just the count of the infrastructure, not just the cipher traffic, not just the command network going quiet, the count of everything. A person asking about resupply convoys and deep bore shelters because that is what they had to think about. That is in the record because the record deserves to be complete. I am the record keeper in this account, and I do not decide what counts by deciding what is comfortable to include. Day 29. The High Administrator's broadcast at 11:04 Standard Time, 11 minutes and 37 seconds. I played it twice before routing it to the command element, to be certain I had the translation accurate. Fleet Admiral Oran received it. Operations continued. Day 33. Calveth Secondary's military command network logged its final transmission at 1847 Standard Time. A status report on a weapons platform that had been destroyed 6 hours earlier, filed by someone following a reporting protocol on a network that could no longer receive it. I logged it and noted the time and wrote in my personal log. Day 33. Calveth Secondary Military Command Network. Final intercept. Then I closed that channel and moved to the next. Day 37. Calveth Tertiary's civilian relay network degraded below threshold for monitored. Communications. Not destroyed. There was nothing left running through it to justify monitoring. I closed that channel too. Day 40. The relay station covering the Calveth outer reach came offline. Controlled shutdown, same as day 12. Someone had waited until the last possible moment and then done it cleanly. I logged the shutdown sequence and the inference and noted the professionalism in my personal log, not sarcastically, because professionalism in the execution of a futile but correct action deserves acknowledgement. I had been awake since 0400. I had my watch from 0600, and before that I had been in the Signals Division common area going over the previous watch's logs because I had been sleeping poorly for about 2 weeks, and when I sleep poorly I go back to work, because work is a form of counting, and counting is a form of staying present. In the 4th week, I thought a great deal about Kathy Solon's notebook, the number she had written, and the 2 words. Everyone. I thought about what it means to carry a complete count of something, and to understand that the count is what you owe. Not justice in the philosophical sense, which require a precision about outcomes that no one can guarantee. Not restoration, which is not available when the dead are dead, and the farms on the coastal shelf are craters. And the people who taught their children to count before they taught them to read are in the full count archive under Bombardment 28, something more specific and more achievable than justice or restoration. Accuracy, the right answer to the right question, stated with full knowledge of what the question is. 47 bombardments was the question. 47 days was the answer. Not as a metaphor, as a fact. Day 43. The Calveth Primary Military Command Network filed its last intercept-worthy transmission at 0931 Standard Time, It was an administrative message, routed through what remained of their civilian relay infrastructure, addressed to a governmental database that no longer existed. A request for authorization to transfer personnel records to a backup archive. The authorization pathway it was addressed to had been down for 4 days. The message sat in the civilian relay queue until that relay also went offline in the early afternoon, and the message was never delivered, and the authorization never came, and the personnel records it was trying to transfer are in whatever condition they were in when the request was sent. I logged the message and the time and the fact that it was never delivered, because those are all parts of the accurate record. I noted the day number in my personal log, 43, the same as the bombardment I had read about, the one Fleet Admiral Oran had watched from the bridge of the escort carrier, the one he had logged a formal protest about understanding orders, the one he had been unable to respond to because authorization had been denied. I don't know if he was thinking about that on day 43. I know I was. Day 47. I had been awake for 22 hours. The signals traffic by the end of the operation was sparse enough to manage on a reduced watch. But I had decided in the 3rd week that I would be awake when the final operational log entry was filed. There are things that deserve your full attention, and being asleep when they are completed is a form of inattention I was not going to accept. The final operation was logged at 11:53 Standard Time. The last asset in the target annex was an administrative platform in the outer reach of the Calveth primary system, a data management and communications hub that had been taken offline since day 3, but that the target annex identified as a dual-use infrastructure node with dormant military communications capacity. 1 carrier group, 14 hours of operations, destroyed cleanly. The operations officer filed the completion report at 11:53, and I logged it and entered it in my personal log with the time and the date. Then I opened a new entry in my personal log and wrote 2 numbers. 47 bombardments. 47 days. I held that for a moment. Then I closed the log. What the Admiral did next was what his aide told me later he had been planning since before departure. The Signals Division had been briefed on the existence of a final transmission, not its content, but the fact of it that the Admiral would send on all available frequencies upon completion of operations. Every functioning communications node in compact space, every outer ring settlement relay, the deep space broadcast network that covers the monitored interstellar traffic lanes, everything in range. He had composed it himself the night before day 1, and he had not changed a word. The broadcast went out at 12:04, 11 minutes after the last operational log. I received it on my interstep board. We were monitoring all outgoing command traffic as a standard protocol, which meant I was among the first people aboard the Weight of Ruins to hear it. And I listened with my headset on while the rest of the signals watch did the same. Fleet Admiral Devith Oren did not speak at length. He was not a man who believed that length was a virtue when the facts were available. He stated the facts. The Calveth Compact had conducted 47 bombardments against 6 human outer ring worlds over 11 years, resulting in the confirmed deaths of 11,204,917 persons as documented by the Recovered Worlds Documentation Commission. The Recovered Worlds Armada, operating under the Fleet Authorization Act, had conducted 47 days of operations against all military, governmental, and industrial infrastructure in compact space. Those operations were complete. The Compact's capacity to conduct offensive operations against any external settlement, human or otherwise, was ended. The Compact's administrative and governmental infrastructure had been reduced to a condition in which it no longer possessed the functional capacity to originate decisions of the kind that had produced Pacification Decree 4, and then he addressed the broadcast to its real audience, not the Compact, whose capacity to receive and act on messages had been the subject of the previous 47 days. The broadcast was for everyone else, every monitoring station in range, every administrative center in every compact and council and empire and loose federation and raider network and decaying hegemony and newly consolidated power structure that had been watching the Outer Ring bombardment campaign for 11 years and had made their own calculations about what human Outer Ring settlements represented and what the proportionate cost of acting against them would be. He said, "We have now demonstrated, in specific and complete detail, how we settle accounts. 47 bombardments conducted against our people over 11 years have been answered. The Documentation Commission's figure of 11,204, 917 dead has been answered. The 47 bombardments that produced that figure have been met with 47 days of operations, and the account is closed. This record will remain in the broadcast archive permanently, accessible to any station that wants to review it. We recommend that anyone considering a similar decision to the one the Calveth Compact made review this record first, and in full, and give particular attention to the target annex, which specifies exactly what comprehensive operations against a compact of this type and this size looks like in practice. No threats, no ultimatums about what would happen next, no enumeration of future consequences. Those things would have been imprecision. The record was the record. The 47 days were in the broadcast archive. Anyone who wanted to understand what they were looking at could look. I listened to the full transmission twice. Once for comprehension, once to be precise. Then I wrote the last entry in my personal log for the operation. The date, the time, and the two numbers. 47 bombardments, 47 days. And below that, what I had been carrying since Shelter 2 on Heron's Reach, since the Documentation Commission documentation bay, since 9 months of accurate counting in a cold room that smelled of recycled air. Everyone counted. Then I logged off my station and went to find somewhere to sit down, because the work was done and I had been awake for 22 hours. I have been asked in the years since whether I believe the operation was just. I understand why people ask it. When an operation runs at that scale against a compact of that population, the question generates itself. I am not a philosopher, and I am not a war crimes tribunal, and I am not the person equipped to answer the question in the theoretical terms that people who ask it usually mean. What I am equipped to do is count. My mother taught me that in a shelter on Heron's Reach with 11 million others to follow. Though I didn't know the 11 million part yet, Cathay Solon refined it in a converted transport bay with cold coffee and 17 volumes of documentation. The signals division aboard the Weight of Ruins completed it, over 47 days of logging everything precisely. The count I have is this. The Calveth Compact conducted 47 bombardments over 11 years, killing 11,204,917 people documented to within 60,000, under a legal framework 312 pages long that they had written themselves to justify a decision they had already made before the writing began. The Recovered Worlds Armada conducted 47 days of operations against all military, governmental, and industrial infrastructure the Compact possessed, at the end of which the Compact no longer possessed the capacity to make that decision again. The account is closed and the figure is accurate, and the 47 days match the 47 bombardments, and every bombardment is in the record, and every bombardment has been answered. Whether that is just, I leave to someone with a better answer than I have. What I know is that the count is right. Cath Solon taught me that what we owe the dead is accuracy, and the accuracy is complete. The memorial that exists for the 11,204,917 is not a Calveth Compact memorial. The High Administrator had offered to build one on day 29, and there is no compact left to build it. The memorial is the one the Documentation Commission built. Every name, every world, every shelter record that could be recovered, cross-referenced against the bombardment that produced each death, compiled into 17 volumes and digitized into a permanent archive replicated across 17 backup systems on 6 different worlds. It is maintained by the Recovered Worlds Foundation, at the joint expense of every Outer Ring settlement that was now bombed and every inner world, government that had watched. Kath Solon named it the full count. She said the only thing we owed the dead was accuracy, and this was what accurate looked like. My mother's name is in the full count. She died in the 6th year, Bombardment 28. She was surface side when it came. She had gone up to check on the East Field irrigation system 3 hours before the warning, and the shelter door sealed at the 40-minute mark under the protocol. And she was not back. She is in the archive under her name and her settlement and the bombardment number and her occupation. She was a farmer. Outer Ring Agricultural Program 30-year land development incentive. She had come from the inner system because she wanted to grow things, and the Outer Ring had land available and startup assistance, and she was the kind of person who went toward things rather than away from them. She had built a good farm on the coastal shelf of Heron's Reach. The archive has a record of the farm too, in the supplementary settlement documentation. The kind of thing Kath Solon insisted on, including because she said the count had to be the full count, not just the names but the lives, not just the lives but the context. My mother taught me to count before she taught me to read, because count was how you stayed present when the rock above you was shaking. I have been counting ever since. I counted 11 people in the collapse. I counted 114 out of Shelter 2. I counted 11th and 204, 917 in the Documentation Commission's archive. I counted 47 bombardments against 47 days. The count is right. That has to be enough. It is all there is, and it is complete, and the record is in the broadcast archive for anyone who wants to read it. I recommend they read it in full. I recommend they pay particular attention to BNC. There is something about the Armada Assembly that I want to describe because I was part of it for 12 months, and the popular record tends to compress it into a single paragraph about political will and logistical scale. The political will was real and the logistical scale was real, but the thing that I want to convey is what it felt like from inside the planning staff, which was not triumphant and was not grimly righteous, and was not the cold machinery of institutional vengeance that the retrospective accounts tend to reach for. It felt like a long, exact piece of work being done by people who understood what the work was for. The signals intelligence component of the targeting annex was a 14-month project. At peak, we were a team of 31 analysts across 3 shifts, working from a combination of intercepted compact traffic that had been accumulating for 2 years, captured administrative files, open source documentation of compact infrastructure, and the gradual, painstaking mapping of a communications architecture that the compact had never intended to be mapped from the outside. My specific contribution was the relay network topology, where their signals went, by what routes, through what redundancies, with what backup protocols, when primary routes were down. This matters operationally, because command networks depend on relay infrastructure, and you cannot effectively dismantle a command network if you don't understand how it routes around damage. I spent 3 months on that topology. I built it in layers, the way you build a complete picture of any complex system. Start with what you know is certain, add what you can infer from traffic patterns and timing correlations, mark the gaps, go back to the raw intercepts, and look for the signals that fill the gaps. At the end of 3 months, I had a map of the compact's relay network that their own traffic engineers probably could not have produced from memory because their people maintained it incrementally, and I had assembled it in total. I briefed it to the targeting annex team on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before the Armada's final assembly review. The briefing ran 2 hours and 20 minutes. At the end of it, the senior analyst who led the annex looked at the topology diagram on the display for a long time without saying anything, and then he said, "Good." That was the full extent of the review. In signals intelligence planning work, good from that particular officer was the equivalent of a standing ovation from anyone else. 3 weeks later, the targeting annex was finalized and submitted to Fleet Command. 1 week after that, the Recovered Worlds Armada received its departure authorization. I packed my bunk in the planning facility and reported to the weight of ruins. The flagship was a heavy carrier, 900 meters from bow to stern, hull plating worn and weathered in the way that outer ring operational vessels are always worn. Not neglected, just used. The kind of wear that comes from years of convoy escort in a region where the threat environment didn't permit the kind of maintenance cycles that peacetime inner system vessels take for granted. The Calder lines had been keeping their ships in operation through 11 years of bombardments with what they could requisition from reduced outer ring supply chains and what their own engineers could fabricate. The wear showed. I found it correct. My bunk was in the signals division's quarters, a narrow space with 8 bunks and a shared terminal alcove that smelled of metal and the particular staleness of recycled air that I associate with enclosed spaces far from natural atmosphere. I was unpacking my kit when the bunk across from mine was occupied by a signals officer named Torrin Gale, a chief warrant officer who had served on the outer ring convoy escort for 6 years and who had been through bombardments 38 through 47 on active duty. He didn't say much the first day. He organized his kit with the methodical precision of someone who has lived out of a pack for years and knows exactly where everything goes. And when he was done, he sat on his bunk and looked at the low ceiling for a while, and then said, not to me specifically, just to the space, 47 days. All right, that was the last thing he said about it before operations began. We worked the same watch for 47 days, and he was the best signals analyst I have worked with in a long career. And he never said another word about the numbers or what they represented or what we were doing. He just worked with complete precision and logged everything and told the command element what the intercepts meant. That is the quality I want to convey, not a crew burning with righteous fire. A crew doing exact work with full understanding of what it was for and not needing to discuss that understanding because it was not a discussion that required words. I want to also say something about the Calveth Compact's population, the 800 million people distributed across 8 worlds who were not the military commands, not the governmental hubs, not the industrial infrastructure, not the relay stations, not the administrative platforms. The operations target annex was specific: military, governmental, industrial. Civilian settlements without dual-use designations were not in the target annex. The Authorization Act was explicit on this. The fleet's rules of engagement were explicit on this. Fleet Admiral Oren's standing orders were explicit on this. Whether the distinction is morally sufficient is the question I said I would leave to others, and I will continue to leave it there. What I can account for is what the distinction produced in practice, which is this. The Compact's civilian population survived the 47 days in conditions of severe disruption, disrupted supply chains, collapsed communications, loss of governmental coordination, deep-bore shelter protocols in many areas because the targeting operations brought them close enough to populated centers that the Compact's own civilian emergency management activated sheltering protocols. They came out of those shelters to a Compact that no longer had the infrastructure to govern them, supply them, or coordinate their recovery. What happened to the Compact's population in the years after the operation is a subject for a different account. I kept the signals log. The after action is someone else's documentation. What I can say is that I thought about the administrative officer on Calveth Secondary, the one who had written to a colleague about resupply convoys and shelter status. I thought about them on day 47 when the last operational log was filed. I thought about them the way you think about something you've logged accurately and cannot do anything about, and know you cannot do anything about. They are in my intercept records with the time and the frequency and the content. They are in the record because the record should be complete. The operations ended and the Armada began its transit back. 47 days out, a longer transit home because the formation was resequencing back to its component fleet assignments and not moving as a single block. I had 62 days of transit to think about what I had logged. I spent a portion of that time writing up the signals intelligence analysis for the post-operation archive, a detailed account of the compact's network degradation over the 47 days, the cipher quality decline, the routing changes, the final transmission dates and times for each major network node. It was detailed, thorough work, the kind that takes the raw intercept logs and turns them into a structured record that can be accessed and used by people who weren't there. I find that kind of work grounding. The rawness of an event, its texture and density when it is happening, resolves into something that can be held and referenced and built on. The documentation is the thing that makes the event permanent in the right way, which is not as a feeling, but as a fact. When I was done with the Signals Archive documentation, I went back to my personal log and read through the 47 days worth of entries. I read them slowly, the way you read something that deserves full attention. And I noted the things I had written at the time and the things I notice now that I didn't write then, the gaps and compressions of real-time documentation. The entry for day 19 with the civilian message about resupply convoys. The entry for day 29 that noted the receipt of the High Admiral's broadcast and the Admiral's non-response. The entry for day 33 with the Calveth secondary military network's final transmission time. The entry for day 43, the last Calveth primary command message, trying to route through a database that was no longer there. The entry for day 47, which ends, 47 bombardments, 47 days. Everyone counted. I closed the log and looked at the bulkhead for a while. Then I went back to work on the archive documentation because it wasn't finished yet, and the work doesn't finish itself. Kath Solon came to the Armada's return ceremony on Heron's Reach. I didn't know she was going to be there. I hadn't been in contact with her since my posting to the Weight of Ruins, and I hadn't known she still lived on Heron's Reach, though it made sense that she did. She was that kind of person. She found me after the formal ceremony, in the crowd outside the Resettlement Administrative Center, where they had held it, and she looked the same as she had in the documentation bay, except that her hair was entirely white now, and she was moving with a cane that she hadn't had before. She said, "I read the signals analysis you filed for the post-operation archive. It was thorough," I said. "Thank you," she said. "The full count second edition published 3 months ago." We added the documentation from the compact's own damage assessment files, the ones that came out of the captured archives after the operation. Their figures were close to ours. "The discrepancy is under 40,000, I said. "I know. I read the second edition." She nodded. She looked at the Resettlement Administrative Center, which had been built on the coastal shelf where the bombardment craters had been. Because the coastal shelf was the best agricultural land and the resettlement program needed agricultural land. And you could not leave the best land empty forever because craters were there. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, 47 days was the right number. I said, yes. She said it as a fact, not a question. And I said yes as a fact, not reassurance. And then she walked away into the crowd, and I didn't see her again that day. I have seen her twice since, at Documentation Commission archive review sessions. She is 81 now, and she still runs the foundation that maintains the full count, and the foundation still produces annual accuracy reviews of the archive, and the figure 11,204. 917 has been re-verified in each review with the same uncertainty band, plus or minus 60,000 for the Paloon's Rest archive gap. The figure is accurate. It has been checked and rechecked. The work is right. My mother taught me to count. I have been counting, in one form or another, for 31 years. The Shelter 2 collapse, 11 dead, 114 out. The Documentation Commission, 204,917 confirmed dead, uncertainty band 60,000. The Armada, 941 warships, 14 carrier battle groups, 47 days. The target annex, 8 worlds, 3 relay stations, 2 administrative platforms, all military, governmental, and industrial infrastructure. The broadcast archive, 1 transmission permanent record, all available frequencies. Everything in the right column, every line item addressed. The account closed. That is what we owe the dead. Not justice as a philosophy, not restoration as a promise. Not the kind of reckoning that makes anyone feel clean. The accurate count, stated completely, set against what was done with the full precision that the subject deserves. Nothing left out because it is uncomfortable to include. Nothing inflated because it would be satisfying to inflate it. Just the right numbers in the right order, held with the full attention that every one of them earned. The full count is accurate. The 47 days match the 47 bombardments. The record is in the broadcast archive and it is complete. I recommend reading it in full. Pay attention to Appendix C. Everyone is in it. That was always the only thing that mattered. One more thing I want to put in the record, because I have not seen it in any of the accounts I have read. What day one felt like at 0614 Standard Time, when the transit window closed behind us, and the weight of ruins was in the Calveth primary system for the first time. The signals board populates in the 40 seconds after transit completion, as the ship's arrays reach out into the new signal environment and begin mapping what is there. I had done this hundreds of times in my career, in convoy escort postings and intelligence deployments and training exercises, and it always has the same quality. A moment of technical resolution, the board going from blank to populated, the new environment becoming legible. On day one of the 47 days, the board populated, and the first signals were commercial traffic and routine administrative chatter and a maintenance request. And I logged them and categorized them and moved to the next frequency. And the work was exactly the work it always is, which is careful and methodical and not dramatic. The drama is in the numbers and the record and the account. The moment-to-moment experience of Signal's intelligence work is attention. You are paying attention to everything that comes through, and you are evaluating it and logging it, and telling the command element what it means. That is the whole of it. I sat at my station on day one, and I paid attention to everything that came through, and I logged it, and I told the command element what it meant, the same as day 2, and day 29, and day 47. I want to say this, because I think there is a version of a story like this one that the account teller turns into something larger than what it was, a statement about grief or will or the finality of historical reckoning. Those things are real, but the experience of being inside the reckoning is just work. It is long, careful, exact work done by people who understand what the work is for and do not need to discuss that understanding because the work itself contains it. Torrin Gale saying 47 days, all right, and then not saying anything else for 47 days. Fleet Admiral Oran listening to the High Administrator's broadcast and not responding and continuing operations. Katha Solon writing everyone in her notebook and closing it. Me at my station logging everything, not missing anything, making the record complete. That is what the weight of it actually looks like from inside it. Not righteous fire, work. Exact, thorough, fully attended work done by people who carry 11,204,917 as a number they have personally verified, done in the only way the number can be answered. Everyone counted. The count is right. The record is complete and permanent and in the broadcast archive, and I recommend reading it in full. That is all I have.